The story of Jacob's breeding sticks shows an incredible amount of insight into the way genetics work, especially from the perspective of evolutionary biology, natural selection, and survival of the fittest. This is the story. Jacob tends to the animals for his father-in-law, Laban. Laban is unfair to Jacob, and he constantly changes his wages according to the Bible. Jacob wants to leave with his wives and start a new life elsewhere. Jacob devises a deal that seems unfair for himself. He will let the solid black animals breed. Any that show patterned coats like spotted, speckled, or streaked will be his payment. Laban accepts this deal, knowing that most solid-colored animals will most likely produce solid-colored offspring. These are basic observations through breeding. We now know the genetic factors that contribute to this. Two solid-colored coated animals are more likely to pass down this gene, and they're more likely to have this dominant in their genetic lineage. This is why Laban gladly accepts this deal, knowing that it's unfair for Jacob. The story says that Jacob gets 3 plants. He half debarks them and lays them in the water trough during the mating season. The Bible says that he removes the weaker animals as the breeding season ensues. The majority of the animals that were born during the mating season had patterned coats, meaning spotted, speckled, or streaked. Hence, Jacob's method gave him a vast amount of animals to take with him as payment. This is a summary of the story in Genesis 30 regarding Jacob and his breeding sticks. This is magic, right? Or is Jacob practicing science? To fully understand this story, we must examine the context and associate it with what we understand about genetics in nature. Pattern-coded genes in animals, like zebras, has been shown to be an adaptation that wards off predators. Hence, it's called nature's camouflage. In the predators, it helps them hide so that they can obtain prey easier. In the prey, it helps them blend in so they can evade predators. And this is especially true when considering the impact that insects have on animals. Insects use several tactics to seek out and differentiate between predators and prey, like heat, carbon dioxide, and visual cues. Studies have shown zebras are much less likely to be attacked by insects than their counterparts due to their patterned coats. This is not a theory. This is an observable fact, published thoroughly through the last couple centuries. This is also reflected in nature, as the majority of applicable animals display this pattern-coded gene throughout natural selection. It's an adaptation that has saved millions of animals' lives through history and continues to. And like adaptations with this type of benefit for survival, this is reflected throughout the best gene pools in the animal kingdom. Mass bug bites bring a wide range of symptoms, from death, disease, infection, weakened immune systems, malnutrition, distress, anxiety, vision problems, hearing loss, loss of appetite, ostracized from the herd, birth defects. The list is endless of the potential negative effects to the lineage when having no natural ways to combat insects that are attacking them. With all of these factors considered, an animal without a patterned coat or nature's camouflage is more susceptible to these mass insect attacks, leading to weaker genetics down the lineage. Fortunately, animals seek out the strongest and healthiest partners when considering breeding instinctually. Thus, this is reflected in nature throughout the applicable animals with the predominancy of the patterned coat. All this taken into account, this demands the evolutionary prediction that the strongest lineage of these applicable animals will contain this genetic code for the patterned coats. Whether it's recessive or active, it should absolutely be present in the genetic coding through natural selection, survival of the fittest. And this is absolutely a correct prediction, as we can observe this in nature with the pattern-coded animals taking precedence over the solid-coded animals in the applicable kinds. Nature's pressures are taken into account when establishing gene pools and selecting genetics to make up the animal's offsprings. Christians believe this is God's design. Atheists believe this is evolution's design. But regardless what you believe, the logic is undeniable and not even debated. So why is this relevant to the story of Jacob? Jacob gathered 3 types of plants. He half debarked them and placed them in front of the animals in the breeding pen. Anyone who's ever been in a forest for even a remotely short period knows plants attract insects, some more than others, and some will even attract specific kinds if you know what you're looking for. So though it's not definitively known which plants Jacob chose, it is logical to conclude that he was bringing predators to the breeding pen. So how did all the solid-colored animals that he kept in the breeding pen produce pattern-coded offspring? The white gene is known to be dominant in sheep. Not ironically, Jacob removed all the animals that had any white in them. Jacob was woke. He removed them along with all the pattern-coded animals and the brown-colored animals, leaving predominantly black-coded animals to breed. Black absorbs the sun, hence the animals heated up and expelled more carbon dioxide, the two major cues that invite insects to terrorize the animal. As the animals were breeding among the insects that were attracted by Jacob's plants, the Bible says, as the animals bred, Jacob removed the weaker ones that were not suitable for breeding. This gives us a major clue that this was in fact the method that Jacob was using, as he only knew which animals were weaker as the breeding ensued, rather than when initially sorting out the animals. So this tells us that something was occurring that told Jacob that these animals were the weaker ones, only as the breeding occurred. So the question is, what was occurring that led Jacob to decide which animals were weaker or less likely to pass on the pattern-coded gene that he was seeking out? Given the logic and reasoning of the explanation of this scenario based on evolutionary biology, the animals' genetics that were unable to bear insect bites and the annoyance would have naturally separated themselves from the herd and attempted to evade the insects. Thus, Jacob removed them, considering them weak and unsuitable to breed, in accordance with the biblical narrative. In accordance with evolutionary biology, natural selection, survival of the fittest, the ancestors of these animals would have built up an immunity to insect attacks through their pattern coat or nature's camouflage that ward off the majority of the insects, leaving the insects to focus on the solid-coated animals. So rather than the pattern-coated animals being overwhelmed by insect attacks, their pattern coats rendered them the second choice to their counterparts with a solid coat, meaning the pattern-coated animals only received a minor fraction of the insect attacks compared to their counterparts with the solid coats. This allows their immune systems to build up an immunity to these bug bites, salivas, and venom, as it's slowly introduced into their system, rather than being overwhelmed by attacks, weakening their immune system, causing them stress, in turn rendering them the weaker animal in the present and the future regarding their genetics due to their immune system's response. This is the same principle as how humanity implements vaccines. Hence, the animal's present and future genetics rendered them more suitable for breeding, being the stronger animal through animal instincts. Animals seek out the strongest and healthiest mates when breeding to produce the best genetic offspring. The animals that had the best immune responses and tolerance for these insect attacks have them thanks to the genetics of their pattern-coded ancestors, meaning they are almost certain to carry the pattern-coded gene in their genetics, whether recessive or active, greatly increasing the probability that these animals would produce pattern-coded offspring through genetics and environmental pressures. This is the basic fundamentals of evolutionary biology, survival of the fittest, and natural selection. It's also important to note that many food compounds have the ability to affect the way genes are expressed in the genetic coding. So if you experimented with your animals of consuming different plants and insects, you may be able to conclude which organisms possess the desired compounds to affect the color gene during gene expression. This may be why Jacob lured the insects to the water troughs, in accordance with the biblical narrative. Though this may have been a contributing factor, it's not really necessary when considering the logic due to the way genes are expressed and passed down through natural selection and what we understand about recessive genes and how they are activated. In accordance with the scenario, the method that Jacob was using makes perfect sense given what we understand about how genetics are built up and passed down through lineages in nature. As well, there may have been psychological factors that contributed to the gene expression in these animals. Though the research on coat gene expression manipulation based on diet and psychological factors is not well documented among the animal kingdom, we know that these factors play a vital role when considering the way genes are expressed. It's also interesting to note that not all the offspring were pattern coded. Only the majority, clearly displaying that this story isn't about God's magic, rather it's about some genetic factors at play. Otherwise, it would be reasonable to conclude that the story would insinuate that all the animals were born with patterned coats, not some of them, thus displaying God's power and magic. But this isn't what we see. Rather, we see what's in line with the genetic factors when considering natural selection and why animals have patterned coats. The story is clearly displaying that Jacob is practicing science, not magic. Though he didn't understand how or why these factors affected the outcome, only that they did, likely through his observations and experimentations. The Bible doesn't claim that God told Jacob to do these processes with the plants. Jacob just did this on his own accord, likely because he knew what the outcome would be, because he did it before through his experimentation as he constantly tended to these animals. Because he realized that the strongest genetics were in the pattern-coded animals, whether recessive or not. Meaning, the solid-coded animals possessed the recessive pattern-coded gene, waiting to be activated through environmental pressures and dominance in accordance with natural selection, which is why the majority of the animals displayed the pattern-coded gene expressed through the genetic codes. In the next chapter, Jacob has a vision where God showed him that the animals were in fact pattern-coded animals. Despite Jacob seeing that they were solid-colored and understanding the process yet not the genetics, God told him they were in fact pattern-coded animals, and that's how this was achieved. And what we now understand about how genetics are built through survival of the fittest, it shows that God in the Bible had an understanding of the recessive genes that were in these animals. They were in fact pattern-coded animals, as they retained this recessive gene in their genetics, though it wasn't yet expressed. This biblical story tells us that God had undeniable understanding of the genetics long before modern science came along to realize it. If evolutionists accept that pattern coats are an adaptation to ward off predators, especially insects, for a stronger genetic coding in the lineage through natural selection, and Jacob brought in that which attracts these predators, then removed what he deemed as the weak animals only as the breeding process ensued. It baffles my mind that evolutionary biologists call this story magic, despite the clear and obvious descriptions of the fieldwork they call themselves professionals in. The Bible story of Jacob and his breeding sticks is displaying an incomprehensible brilliance in comprehending genetics, in accordance with what we understand today. There's nothing magical about this story, except, perhaps, how it confuses the atheists.